In the final days of December 1980, Eastern England was quiet. The Cold War was not. Beyond the hedgerows and small villages of Suffolk, 2 NATO air bases sat on constant alert. Their runways pointed east, their mission unambiguous. Inside that perimeter, a stretch of pine and fir known as Rendlesham Forest lay between concrete radar and weapons storage. It was not a remote wilderness. It was a working military environment. On paper, nothing remarkable happened there. In practice, something did. What makes Rendlesham different is not how strange the story became later, but how ordinary it was at the beginning. Security patrols, radio calls, written reports, no civilians seeking attention, no late-night callers to tabloids, just uniformed personnel doing routine work inside an active defense installation. Among them was Jim Peniston, a U.S. Air Force security policeman tasked with protecting assets few civilians would ever see. With him was John Burroughs, another enlisted airman, on a patrol that should have ended without comment. And overseeing the response, in the hours that followed, was Charles Halt, the deputy base commander, an officer trained to document anomalies, not speculate about them. Their accounts would not match perfectly. That matters. Their ranks would not protect them from skepticism. That matters too. And the institutions above them, the United States Air Force, the Royal Air Force, and later the UK Ministry of Defense, would respond carefully, selectively, and sometimes not at all. What remains today is not a single story, but a collision of records, memories, and silence. Lights were seen. That is documented. Something drew personnel into the forest. That is not disputed. Radiation readings were taken but not preserved. Audio was recorded, but not continuously. Radar was discussed, but no tapes remain. Each absence matters as much as what survived. At the time, none of the people involved believed they were participating in history. They were responding to an incident. Only later would the phrase Britain's Roswell attach itself to Rendlesham, dragging with it assumptions, expectations, and conclusions that the original evidence does not support. This documentary will not assume an extraterrestrial origin. It will not dismiss testimony because it is inconvenient. Official explanations will be treated as data, not verdicts. Eyewitness accounts will be examined alongside their limitations. Where memories shift, we will slow down. Where documents contradict one another, we will stay with the contradiction. Where skepticism explains part of the case, we will acknowledge it fully. And where it does not, we will not rush to fill the gap. Because Rendlesham is not a story about belief. It is a story about process. About how military institutions respond when something does not fit expectation. About how records are created and how they disappear. About what is written immediately and what emerges decades later. And about how uncertainty survives, even when everyone involved insists they were doing their job correctly. This investigation is supported in part by OPA Nutrition, a company that values long-form focus, clarity, and disciplined inquiry. You can learn more at opanutrition.com. If you value careful, extended investigations like this one, consider subscribing and let us know where you're listening from, because the location matters, and in this case, the forest still does. What happened there has never been resolved, not because no one looked, but because when they did, the answers refused to align, and that is where we begin. The forest itself is often treated as a backdrop. That is a mistake. Rendlesham Forest was not an isolated wilderness in 1980. It was a managed tract of land, interlaced with footpaths, bordered by fencing, and pressed tightly between 2 active military installations. To the west stood RAF Woodbridge. To the south, RAF Bentwaters. Together, they formed a single operational complex, officially British, operationally American. Both bases were staffed by the United States Air Force under agreements that placed U.S. personnel, equipment, and security responsibilities on UK soil. This mattered then, it still matters now. Bentwaters and Woodbridge were not ordinary airfields. They were frontline Cold War assets, positioned for rapid response to Warsaw Pact movement, their aircraft loaded, their crews trained to launch on short notice. Security was not symbolic, it was procedural. Perimeter patrols followed fixed routes, radio checks were logged, unexplained incursions were treated as potential threats, not curiosities. The forest fell inside that security equation. Parts of it lay outside the base fences, yet close enough to sensitive areas, that movement there drew attention. This created an ambiguity: civilian land, military concern, British jurisdiction, American responsibility. In 1980, this overlap was rarely discussed publicly, but it shaped how the incident unfolded and how it was later recorded. When Jim Penniston and John Burroughs entered the forest, they were not chasing rumors. They were responding to what appeared at the time to be a possible downed aircraft or an unauthorized intrusion. That assumption was entirely conventional. Unknown lights near a weapons facility did not invite speculation. They triggered procedure. What complicates reconstruction today is that the forest was not sealed. Local residents had walked it for years. Fishermen, hikers, and dog walkers moved through it freely. That openness has fueled skepticism. If something extraordinary occurred there, why was no civilian witness recorded at the time? The answer may be procedural rather than mysterious. Military personnel were not required to canvass civilian testimony. They were required to secure the area, identify threats, and report up the chain of command. Civilian sightings, if they occurred, would not automatically enter military logs. What remains are partial records, maps that show patrol routes but not precise stopping points, security logs that confirm activity but omit narrative detail. A forest that looks today smaller than memory suggests, and here uncertainty enters quietly. Distances estimated at night, under stress, without reference points, often expand in recollection. Clearings disappear. When later investigators attempted to match witness descriptions to physical locations, they encountered mismatches. Some skeptics argue this alone resolves the case. That misidentification, combined with unfamiliar terrain, produced a cascade of misunderstanding. But that explanation assumes the forest was unfamiliar. For base security personnel, it was not. Penniston and Burroughs had patrolled those boundaries before. They knew the fences, they knew the access roads, they knew where the forest ended and where restricted ground began. What they encountered, according to their early statements, did not behave like a distant lighthouse or a passing aircraft or a flare drifting with the wind. That does not make their interpretation correct. It does mean the location alone does not dismiss their response. The forest sits at the center of this case because it magnifies every uncertainty. Open enough to invite alternative explanations, restricted enough to limit documentation, familiar enough to question misidentification, dark enough to distort perception. It is both ordinary and problematic, and when events unfolded there, they did so inside a landscape that resists clean reconstruction. The ground still exists, the trees still stand, but the moment that mattered most passed without cameras, without preserved measurements, and without a single unified authority responsible for explaining what happened. That gap remains, not dramatic, not theatrical, just unresolved. The first reports came late at night, after routine had already settled in. December 26, 1980, just past midnight. Security personnel at RAF Bentwaters received a call describing lights descending beyond the eastern perimeter. At that moment, nothing about the report was extraordinary. Aircraft went down, flares were deployed, navigation beacons failed. Unidentified lights by themselves did not imply anything unusual. What mattered was location. The lights appeared to be inside or immediately adjacent to the boundary zone between the base and Rendlesham Forest. That triggered a response. A small security team was dispatched on foot, standard procedure for a possible crash or unauthorized intrusion. Among them was Jim Penniston. Penniston was not an officer, not an investigator, and not tasked with interpretation. His responsibility was containment, assessment, and reporting. With him was John Burroughs, another security policeman, equally trained, equally accountable. What they knew then was limited. There were lights reported in the forest. They were expected to identify the source, nothing more. As the patrol moved off the base, visibility dropped quickly. The forest absorbed sound, artificial light vanished. What they observed next has been described in different ways over the years, but early statements converge on key points. The lights were not stationary. They appeared to move through the trees. They changed color: red, blue, white. Skeptical explanations often begin here. Colored lights at night are not uncommon. Navigation beacons flash red and white. Emergency vehicles use blue. Lighthouses cycle predictably. These explanations will be examined later, in detail. At this stage, what matters is sequence. Penniston and Burroughs did not report a distant glow on the horizon. They reported approaching a source. As they advanced, the lights appeared to respond, not intelligently, not deliberately, but inconsistently. At times they brightened, at others they dimmed. Then they seemed to retreat. This is where uncertainty enters early. Distance at night is deceptive. Tree cover fragments light. Movement can be illusory. But the patrol continued forward. According to early accounts, the lights descended into a clearing, not a large open space, but an interruption in the tree line. What they believed they saw next was an object on or near the ground. Here the evidence becomes thin. There were no photographs, no immediate sketches, no physical samples recovered that night, only descriptions. Small, triangular, illuminated. Those descriptions were recorded later, not in real time. That distinction matters. What was known then was simply that something unusual appeared to be present. What is known now is filtered through memory, interviews, and repetition. Skeptics argue that this alone invalidates the claim. Memory is fallible. Stress amplifies distortion. Expectation shapes perception. All true, but none of that explains why trained security personnel continued the approach, rather than dismissing the sighting. They did not immediately conclude they were observing a distant beacon. They believed they were closing distance. At some point, radio communication was attempted. Accounts differ on clarity and duration. Some reports suggest interference. Others describe ordinary transmission limits inside dense forest terrain. No preserved radio logs exist from this patrol. That absence does not imply malfunction. It simply means the record is incomplete. What followed by Peniston's account was close proximity. According to Burroughs, the light intensity increased. According to later reconstructions, the object then departed at speed. Not with sound, not with visible propulsion, just gone. Here again, skeptical explanations surface quickly. A flare extinguishing, a light source obscured by trees, an aircraft changing angle. Each is plausible in isolation. What complicates matters is the patrol's reaction afterward. They did not dismiss the event. They did not log it as resolved. They did not return casually. They reported it up the chain. That decision is documented. Back on base, the incident was noted. Discussion followed. At that point, no one was talking about craft, or origins, or significance. They were talking about security. An unexplained presence near sensitive facilities was not acceptable. And yet, no immediate recovery operation followed. No floodlights, no perimeter lockdown. The night ended without closure. That too matters. If the event were clearly a misidentified lighthouse, or a known aircraft, there would have been nothing to escalate. If it were clearly a crash, response would have intensified. Instead, the incident entered a gray zone. Recorded, but not resolved. Reported, but not explained. What Peniston and Burroughs knew then was that they had encountered something they could not identify. What they did not know was that this would not be the end of it. Because whatever moved through that forest on the first night would not remain confined to memory alone, and the silence that followed would not last. What happened next is the most disputed element of the entire case. It is also the most fragile. According to Jim Peniston, the lights did not simply fade or drift away or resolve into something familiar. They led him closer. What he later described was an object on the ground, partially obscured by trees, resting in a shallow depression. At the time, there was no language prepared for this. No checklist, no protocol for unidentified objects that did not resemble aircraft wreckage. Peniston's early statements, made soon after the event, were restrained. He described shape, not origin, size, not intent, small, triangular, smooth surfaces, light emanating from the object itself, not reflected. What he did not describe then is just as important. No sound of impact, no debris field, no scorch marks documented that night. Those absences matter. Later accounts would grow more detailed. Symbols, textures, interactions. But those elements did not appear in the earliest records. That gap between early and later testimony sits at the center of the controversy. Skeptics focus on it heavily. They argue that memory, once exposed to repetition, interviews, and external narratives, can accrete detail. That the mind fills gaps, not maliciously, but unconsciously. This is not a fringe claim. It is well supported by cognitive research. But it does not automatically invalidate everything that came before. Peniston's initial claim was not extraordinary in content. It was extraordinary in context. He was a security policeman reporting an unidentified object inside a sensitive military perimeter, at close range. That alone required documentation. What complicates the record is the lack of contemporaneous physical evidence. No photographs were taken. This was 1980. Cameras were not standard issue on security patrols. No samples were collected. No fragments. No residue preserved. Later impressions in the ground would be discussed. Indentations, marks. But those observations were not formally recorded at the moment they mattered most. By the time investigators returned to the site, weather and foot traffic had already altered the terrain. The forest does not preserve evidence kindly. Skeptical explanations step in here decisively. A misidentified lighthouse beam, filtered through trees, a military aircraft seen at an unusual angle, a meteor fragmenting low on the horizon. Each explanation can account for portions of the report. Lights, movement, brightness. None account cleanly for a structured object perceived at close distance, unless perception itself is the variable. Night operations impaired depth judgment. Dark adapted vision exaggerates contrast. Stress narrows attention. What remains unresolved is why Peniston approached rather than withdrew. Why, faced with uncertainty, he continued forward. Security training does not encourage curiosity, it encourages caution. And yet, by his account, the situation did not feel immediately threatening. That assessment is subjective. It cannot be tested. What can be tested is what happened next. The object, whatever it was, did not remain. Peniston reported that it departed rapidly. Not lifted, not drifted. Gone. There is no measurement of speed, no angle recorded, no corroborating instrumentation, only an abrupt absence. Skeptics argue this is the moment where misinterpretation peaks. A light extinguished, a source obscured by movement, a sudden change in perspective, all plausible. What they cannot explain is why the incident did not end there, why it did not resolve as a mistake, filed away, and forgotten. Instead, Peniston reported the encounter. He did not embellish it immediately. He did not seek attention. He returned to duty. What he knew then was limited to what he saw and what he could not explain. What he did not know was how this account would evolve or how heavily it would be scrutinized. The object on the ground exists today only in testimony. No photograph fixes it in place. No sample anchors it to material reality. That does not make it false. It makes it vulnerable, and it leaves a question suspended between perception and evidence, where it has remained ever since. In the days immediately following the encounter, nothing dramatic happened. No press inquiries, no formal investigation team, no written conclusions. The incident entered the system quietly as a security report, one among many. At that time, what Jim Peniston and John Burroughs knew was limited to what they had experienced and what they had reported. They did not yet know how the story would follow them. Memory in those early stages was still close to the event. Descriptions were spare, language was cautious, there was little interpretation. That would change. Years passed, then decades, and with time came interviews, documentaries, public interest, and repeated retellings. This is where investigators must slow down, because memory does not remain static. Psychological research is clear on this point. Recall is reconstructive. Each act of remembering reshapes the memory itself. Details can sharpen, timelines can compress. Certainty can grow even as original reference points fade. This does not imply deception, it describes a human process. In early statements, Peniston focused on what he observed: shape, light, proximity. In later accounts, additional elements appeared: surface details, markings, symbols. These were not present in the earliest documentation. Skeptics point to this expansion as evidence of narrative contamination, exposure to other UFO cases, media framing, the reinforcing effect of public attention. All are plausible influences. But the analysis cannot stop there, because Burroughs' experience diverged from Peniston's in important ways. Burroughs did not emphasize structure. He emphasized effect, disorientation, physical sensations, after effects that he would later associate with health concerns. Those claims emerged gradually, often in response to questions that did not exist in 1980. Medical documentation has been referenced, but remains contested. Some records support exposure to stress, others do not establish causation. What is clear is that Burroughs' narrative did not mirror Peniston's. That divergence matters. If the story were a single constructed myth, consistency would be expected. Instead, the accounts fracture. Overlap exists, so does contradiction. Investigators are left with a difficult problem. Early testimony carries temporal proximity, but lacks detail. Later testimony carries detail but suffers from distance. Which deserves more weight? There is no clean answer. Some researchers privilege the earliest statements, arguing they are least contaminated. Others note that trauma and confusion can delay articulation, that some experiences are not immediately understood and only later contextualized. What complicates Rendlesham further is that no comprehensive contemporaneous interviews were conducted. No psychologists, no independent investigators, no controlled questioning. The opportunity to freeze memory and time was missed. Instead, recollections evolved in public. Each interview added pressure. Each retelling invited scrutiny. By the time official interest resurfaced, the memories themselves had become part of the evidence. That is an unstable foundation, and yet it cannot simply be dismissed. Because both men have maintained that something genuinely anomalous occurred. Not mysterious, not necessarily extraordinary, but outside their training and expectation. What they knew then was limited. What they know now is filtered through time. Between those 2 points lies the core uncertainty of the case. Not just what was seen, but how remembering it changed what could be known. And once memory becomes evidence, the investigation no longer examines only events, it examines people, their credibility, their consistency, their limits, and that leaves the case balanced uneasily between experience and record, with no clear way to separate them completely. 2 nights later, the forest drew attention again. This time the response came from higher up the chain. In the early hours of December 28, 1980, Charles Halt left the warmth of the operations building and entered the darkness. Halt was not a junior airman. He was the deputy base commander at RAF Bentwaters, a career officer, trained to document anomalies, not chase them. What mattered at that moment was not curiosity, it was pattern. Reports from the first night had not resolved cleanly. Questions lingered. Lights, movement, uncertainty. So Halt assembled a small team and went to the forest himself. What separates this night from the first is documentation. Halt carried a handheld tape recorder, not for drama, not for posterity, for record-keeping. As the group moved through the trees, his voice captured observations in real time. Calm, measured, the audio survives. It is not continuous, it does not explain itself, but it anchors the night to a specific sequence of moments. At the time, Halt did not know this recording would become the most scrutinized artifact of the entire case. What he knew was that lights were again visible, bright points in the sky appearing above the forest, some stationary, some moving. Descriptions vary: white, red, occasionally green. Halt identified one source quickly, a lighthouse, or more precisely, the beam from Orford Ness rotating in the distance. This acknowledgement matters. It demonstrates discrimination, not credulity, but not all the lights aligned with that explanation. At times, Halt described objects that appeared to maneuver, not rapidly, not violently, but inconsistently, changing position relative to the stars, altering brightness. From the ground, that distinction is subtle. Astronomical objects can appear to move as the observer moves. Aircraft lights change intensity with angle and distance. The human eye, in darkness, is easily misled. These are not excuses, they are constraints. What elevated concern was what happened next. Halt and his team reported observing beams of light projected downward, at one point toward the forest floor, at another toward the general direction of the base. This claim is controversial. Skeptics argue that star scintillation, combined with atmospheric effects, can create the illusion of rays. Others suggest that searchlights from distant facilities could appear to sweep irregularly. Those explanations are plausible. What complicates them is Halt's response. He did not dismiss the phenomenon immediately. He continued recording. He continued observing. At one point, radiation readings were taken. The instruments used were not specialized. They were base survey meters. According to later summaries, slightly elevated readings were detected near the area of the first night's encounter. No baseline measurements were preserved. No calibration records survive. The readings were noted, then set aside. This is a critical limitation. Without context, the numbers mean little. Natural background radiation varies, so do instrument sensitivities. Skeptics argue this renders the data meaningless. They are not wrong, but meaningless is not the same as irrelevant. The act of measuring indicates concern. Halt believed something warranted documentation. That belief led him, days later, to produce a memorandum, a short, formal report addressed to the United States Air Force chain of command. The memo was restrained. No speculation about origin, No extraordinary language. Just times, observations, personnel involved. It described unexplained lights, observed over multiple nights, by multiple witnesses. That document exists. It is real. It is verifiable. And yet, it explains almost nothing. What the memo does not include is just as important. No definitive conclusion. No identified source. No follow-up directive. It was filed, then forgotten, or at least set aside. Years later, when the memo resurfaced, it became central to the case. Some treated it as confirmation, others as overinterpretation. Both views missed something quieter. Halt did not write the memo to make a statement. He wrote it because unresolved incidents were supposed to be reported. What he knew then was that he had observed something he could not fully explain. What he did not know was whether anyone else ever would. The audio ends. The memo closes. The lights, whatever they were, do not return that night. No interception followed. No alert was raised. The base continued operating, but the record now included an officer's signature, and with it, a question the documentation could not answer. If nothing unusual occurred, why record it at all? And if something did, why did the record stop there? Once the focus lifts from the forest floor, the case changes character. Because not everything reported at Rendlesham was close or solid or grounded. Much of it was in the sky. That distinction matters. Lights in the sky invite a different set of explanations and a different burden of proof. From the beginning, skeptics have pointed to one source above all others: the lighthouse at Orford Ness Lighthouse. It stands several miles from the forest, its beam rotating at a steady interval, visible across flat coastal terrain. From certain angles, through trees, its light can appear intermittent, colored, and surprisingly bright. Charles Halt acknowledged this immediately. On his audio recording, he identified the lighthouse as a known reference point. That is important. It shows active elimination, not blanket acceptance. But the lighthouse does not resolve every observation. Its beam rotates predictably. Its position does not change. Several witnesses described lights that did not follow that rhythm. Some appeared to move horizontally. Others seemed to hover, then fade. Astronomical explanations enter next. Bright stars near the horizon can appear to drift as clouds move. Planets can seem unusually luminous, especially to dark-adapted eyes. Star scintillation can create the illusion of motion, even beams. These effects are well documented. They explain many UFO reports. The question is whether they explain this one. Halt and others described lights that appeared to track movement. As the observers shifted position, the lights changed relative placement. This could be parallax. It could also be misperception. The problem is that no single explanation accounts for all reported behavior. Aircraft are another candidate. Military aircraft operate at night. Navigation lights flash red, green, and white. An aircraft turning can appear to accelerate or decelerate suddenly, but aircraft makes sound. Distance muffles it, but does not erase it entirely. Several witnesses noted silence. That observation is subjective. Sound travels unevenly at night, but it remains part of the record. Then there's the issue of altitude. Some lights were described as high, others low. Some above the tree line, others beyond it. This variation complicates attribution. If everything were distant, lighthouse and stars might suffice. If everything were low, aircraft or ground-based sources would dominate. Instead, the reports span multiple apparent depths. Skeptics argue that this inconsistency is itself the explanation. Different sources misinterpret it as one event. A lighthouse here, a star there, an aircraft passing through. Human perception connects them. It explains complexity without invoking a single unknown cause, but it requires coincidence. Multiple mundane sources appearing simultaneously, interpreted as related. That can happen. What is harder to explain is the timing, why these observations clustered over 2 nights, why they prompted an officer to document them, why trained personnel continued watching instead of dismissing them quickly. None of this proves anomaly. It does suggest that the situation was not immediately self-resolving. Another factor complicates the skyward analysis: expectation. After the first night, personnel were alert. Awareness changes perception. Once attention is primed, ambiguous stimuli become meaningful. This does not discredit witnesses, it contextualizes them. What was known then was that something unusual might be present. What is known now is that expectation can amplify uncertainty. No photographs exist of the lights, no video, no triangulated measurements. A sky left no trace. Everything rests on description, and description, especially at night, is a fragile foundation. Yet the lights remain central, because they were observed by multiple people over extended periods and by an officer trained to differentiate known from unknown. That does not make them unexplainable, it makes them unresolved. Every proposed explanation fits part of the evidence, none fit all of it cleanly. And so the lights remain suspended between astronomy and aviation, between perception and interpretation. Not mysterious in isolation, problematic in combination, still waiting for a framework that accounts for every observation without forcing the pieces to fit. When investigators look for certainty, they look for instruments, radar, logs, timestamps. At RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge, such systems existed. They were not experimental, they were routine. These bases tracked aircraft daily. They logged movements, communications, and anomalies. So the question emerges quietly. If something unusual occurred, where is the data? Some witnesses later recalled radar contact, blips, returns, objects that did not behave like conventional aircraft. Those recollections are not uniform. Some place radar activity at Bentwaters, others suggest nearby installations. What is missing are the records themselves. No radar tapes have surfaced. No printouts, no logs indicating unidentified targets. Skeptics treat this absence as decisive. If radar detected nothing, they argue, then nothing extraordinary occurred. That conclusion depends on an assumption that all radar detections were preserved. In 1980, that was not standard practice. Radar data was often overwritten, stored briefly, retained only if deemed significant. Significance at the time was defined narrowly. Hostile aircraft, airspace violations, clear threats, ambiguous returns did not always qualify. This does not prove data existed and vanished. It does show why absence is inconclusive. Logs present a similar problem. Security logs confirm patrol activity. They note times and movements. They do not contain narrative detail. They were not designed to. Radio logs, if kept, were not archived long-term. No surviving transcripts document the exchanges from those nights. Again, skeptics see resolution here. If communication interference occurred, it should appear in logs, but radio interference was not always logged as an anomaly, especially in wooded terrain, especially during routine patrols. What remains is an expectation gap. Modern investigations assume data persistence. Cold War operations did not. This does not excuse the absence, it explains it. Another complication arises: jurisdiction. These were US-operated bases on British soil. Radar assets were shared. Reporting channels overlapped. If an event fell below threat thresholds, it could pass through the system without triggering long-term retention. That possibility frustrates investigators today because it leaves no trail to follow, no numbers to analyze, no plots to compare, only recollections. Skeptical explanations return here with force. They argue that without instrumental confirmation, the case rests entirely on perception, and perception, as already established, is unreliable at night. This argument has weight. Science privileges measurement, but the lack of data does not establish a null event. It establishes an unrecorded one. Because the same systems that failed to preserve evidence were the ones trusted to detect threats. If they were imperfect then, their silence now cannot be treated as definitive. What was known then was simply that nothing rose to the level of alarm. What is known now is that alarm is not the same as anomaly. The radar question remains open not because it points towards something unknown, but because it points nowhere at all. An investigative dead end, a space where data should be, but is not. And that absence forces the case back onto testimony, with all its strengths and weaknesses. The instruments did not speak. Whether that is because they saw nothing, or because no one thought to listen long enough, remains uncertain, and that uncertainty continues to shape everything that follows. When the incident reached civilian authorities, it did so quietly. There was no press conference, no emergency briefing, only a paper trail, thin and restrained, moving upward through bureaucratic channels. The UK Ministry of Defence became aware of the events after internal military reporting. What mattered to the ministry was not mystery, it was threat. Their mandate was narrow. Did whatever occurred pose a danger to national security? Did it represent foreign technology? Did it require response? The answer, at least officially, was no. In statements released years later, the ministry would say that the incident was investigated and found to be of no defense significance. That phrase appears repeatedly. carefully chosen, technically precise. It does not say nothing happened. It says nothing threatened the state. That distinction often goes unnoticed. At the time, no public explanation was offered. The event passed without comment. Internally, documents were filed, then archived. Decades later, under pressure from researchers and journalists, some of those files were released. They were incomplete. Redactions remained. Attachments were missing. The most prominent document, Charles Halt's memorandum, appeared among them. The ministry did not dispute its authenticity. They also did not expand on it. Their position remained consistent. No threat, no action required. Skeptics point to this as resolution. If the ministry, with access to classified resources, saw nothing concerning, then the case is closed. That logic assumes transparency. It assumes that all relevant data was shared between agencies. It assumes that ambiguity was explored rather than minimized. Those assumptions are difficult to verify. Cold War governments were not inclined toward openness. Anomalies that did not fit threat models were often deprioritized, not concealed, simply ignored. Another explanation offered later focused on misidentification. Lights from a lighthouse, stars, meteors. The ministry endorsed none of these publicly. They allowed others to propose them. This passivity is revealing. If a simple explanation existed, it could have been stated clearly. Instead, the ministry remained neutral, non-committal. Some interpret this as dismissal, others see it as institutional caution. To declare certainty would invite scrutiny. To remain vague allows the file to close quietly. What the ministry knew then was limited to reports and summaries. They did not conduct an independent field investigation. They relied on military assessments. What they know now is shaped by the same gaps that confront everyone else. Missing data, unpreserved records, conflict in testimony. The official position has not changed. No threat, no significance. But that position answers a different question. It does not tell us what occurred. It tells us why it was set aside. And that leaves the incident in an uncomfortable space. Acknowledged, but unexplained. Recorded, but unresolved. Neither endorsed nor debunked. Just filed away under a category that allows uncertainty to persist without resolution. For an investigation seeking clarity, that silence speaks softly, but it does not speak clearly, and it leaves behind a question that official language never quite addresses. If nothing happened, why does the record exist at all? Once official channels fell quiet, the story did not end. It changed hands. In the years after the incident, Rendlesham existed only in memory and in fragments of paperwork. Then journalists found it. Not immediately, not aggressively. At first it appeared as a curiosity, a strange footnote in Cold War history. Early coverage was restrained. Local papers, specialist magazines. They reported what could be confirmed, an unexplained military incident, multiple witnesses, an official memo, nothing more. But the environment around the story began to shift. The late 1980s and 90s were a different media landscape. The Cold War was ending. Classified archives were opening. Public trust in official narratives was eroding. Unidentified flying objects, once relegated to tabloids, were being re-examined through a national security lens. Rendlesham fit this moment. It involved the military. It involved documents. It involved silence. Journalists returned to the witnesses. Jim Penniston and John Burroughs were asked to recall events that had occurred decades earlier. Each interview added shape. Each retelling added context. Some details sharpened. Others drifted. At the same time, the label appeared, Britain's Roswell. It was not chosen by investigators. It was chosen by headlines. The phrase carried weight. It implied secrecy, cover-up, extraordinary origin. It also compressed complexity. Roswell is remembered as a single crash narrative. Rendlesham was not. But the comparison stuck. As media attention increased, so did expectation. Audiences wanted resolution. Journalists wanted angles. Documentary producers wanted arcs. The incident began to be framed not as an unresolved security event, but as a mystery seeking explanation. This reframing matters, because it altered how testimony was received. Statements were no longer treated as operational reports. They became personal accounts, human stories. That shift amplified emotion but weakened precision. Skeptical voices entered the conversation. Scientists, aviation experts, astronomers, they proposed explanations. Lighthouses, stars, aircraft, meteors. These explanations were often presented as definitive. sometimes without engaging the full record, sometimes without acknowledging what they did not explain. Media coverage favored clarity. Nuance does not headline well. Uncertainty does not resolve segments. So narratives hardened. For some outlets, Rendlesham became proof of something extraordinary. For others, proof of mass misinterpretation. Both positions simplified the case. Neither fully accounted for the evidence as a whole. As the story spread, it began to self-reinforce. New witnesses emerged, some peripheral, some tangential. Some were corroborated, many were not. Separating original testimony from later accretion became increasingly difficult. Researchers attempted to intervene. They traced timelines, cross-checked statements, compared early documents to later interviews. Their conclusions diverged. Some argued that media attention had distorted memory. Others argued it had revealed suppressed experience. Both camps accused the other of bias. The case became polarized. What was once a contained military anomaly turned into a cultural artifact. Its meaning now depended on the audience. To skeptics, it illustrated how stories grow when evidence is thin. To believers, it illustrated how institutions deflect when answers are uncomfortable. Neither interpretation fully resolves the original event. The media did not invent Rendlesham, but it reshaped it. It pulled the incident out of its operational context and placed it into a symbolic one. And in doing so, it introduced a new problem: how to investigate an event once it has become a story. Because stories resist correction. They reward coherence over accuracy. They prefer conclusions to open questions. And Rendlesham by its nature offers none. What remains beneath the headlines is still the same: a small number of witnesses, a small number of documents, a large amount of missing information. The myth grew, the record did not, and separating the two has become one of the hardest parts of understanding what happened at all. Skepticism is often framed as dismissal. In this case, it is better understood as pressure. Pressure applied to every claim, from every angle, until only what withstands it remains. The most common skeptical explanation is also the simplest: that nothing singular occurred, that Rendlesham was not one event, but several ordinary ones misperceived as connected. The lighthouse beam, bright stars low on the horizon, passing aircraft, human expectation. Each element, taken alone, is unremarkable. Together, skeptics argue, they form a pattern only because observers link them. This explanation has real strengths. It requires no unknown technology, no classified programs, no extraordinary assumptions. It accounts for moving lights, changing colors, and apparent beams. It explains why no physical evidence remains. It explains why instruments recorded nothing definitive. And it explains why official institutions found no defense significance. But the explanation begins to strain when applied to every element simultaneously. The lighthouse beam rotates on a fixed cycle. Some reported lights did not. Stars scintillate but do not descend into forests. Aircraft maneuver but leave acoustic signatures and predictable flight paths. Skeptics respond by separating the reports. This light was a star, that one was the lighthouse, another was an aircraft. No single stimulus, only coincidence. This is plausible. It also introduces complexity. Multiple unrelated phenomena occurring in proximity over consecutive nights, drawing trained personnel into repeated observation. Coincidence is not impossible, but it is not trivial. Another skeptical argument focuses on expectation. After the first night, personnel were primed. Once alerted, ambiguous stimuli become meaningful. Lights that would normally be ignored suddenly attract attention. This is well supported by psychology. Expectation alters perception. The challenge here is temporal. Some observations occurred before any shared narrative existed, before the story had shape, before media attention. Expectation alone cannot explain initial engagement. It can explain escalation. It can explain interpretation. It does not fully explain origin. Another line of skepticism targets memory directly, that accounts evolved over time, that details were added, that certainty increased as narrative solidified. This is demonstrably true. Early statements are less detailed than later ones. Symbols and markings appear later. Skeptics argue this discredits the entire account. Investigators must be careful here. Later embellishment does not invalidate earlier core claims. It does require weighting. Early testimony carries proximity. Later testimony carries context. A further skeptical position invokes stress and fatigue. Night patrols, cold conditions, heightened alertness, these factors degrade judgment. They amplify error. Again, this is valid. But stress also narrows focus. It does not typically generate complex, multi-night narratives across independent observers. The skeptical case is strongest when addressing individual elements. It weakens when asked to explain the entire sequence coherently. This does not mean the skeptical position fails. It means it remains partial. There is no single skeptical explanation that resolves all observations without remainder, and there is no non-skeptical explanation that does so either. This symmetry is uncomfortable. Investigations prefer asymmetry. They prefer one side to collapse under scrutiny. Here neither does. The skeptical explanations explain much. They do not explain everything, and the residuals matter, not because they imply something extraordinary, but because they resist tidy categorization. At the end of skeptical analysis, the case does not dissolve. It thins, reduced to fewer claims, stripped of excess but not erased. What remains is a small core of uncertainty, an event that was real enough to prompt response, ambiguous enough to defy resolution, and ordinary enough to be left unresolved without institutional urgency. Skepticism narrows the field. It does not close it, and that leaves the investigation where it began, facing a case that survives both belief and disbelief, still incomplete, still unresolved, still waiting for an explanation that accounts for everything without leaving something behind. After decades of scrutiny, the case does not collapse. It narrows. What remains unresolved is not a single question, but a cluster of them, each reinforcing the others. First, the timing. Why did reports cluster over 2 consecutive nights? Not weeks, not months. 2 brief windows of heightened activity, followed by silence. Coincidence is possible, but coincidence rarely leaves documentation. Second, the witnesses. They were not casual observers. They were not strangers to one another. They were not seeking attention. They were performing assigned duties. Their accounts diverge, but not randomly. They overlap where context demands it, and separate where perception takes over. That pattern is difficult to engineer. It is also difficult to dismiss. Third, the documentation. It exists, but only partially. A memo without conclusions, audio without context, logs without narrative. Each document confirms that something was taken seriously enough to record. None confirm what it was. Fourth, the missing data. Radar records that should have existed, but did not persist. Radio logs that were never archived. Environmental measurements not preserved long enough to be evaluated. Absence is not proof, but repeated absence creates friction. Fifth, the official response. Not denial, not confirmation. Classification as non-threatening. That decision answered a security question, not an explanatory one. It explains why the file closed. It does not explain what it contained. Then there's the role of time. As years passed, memory changed. Accounts expanded. Details accumulated. Some of that growth undermines confidence. Some of it reflects delayed processing. Separating the two is nearly impossible now. And finally, the explanations. Skeptical frameworks account for much. Astronomy explains some lights. Aviation explains others. Psychology explains perception. But no single framework accounts for all observations without discarding part of the record. To accept one explanation fully requires ignoring something else. That trade-off remains unresolved. What is left then is not a mystery in the dramatic sense. It is an administrative anomaly, an event that was real enough to prompt response, but ambiguous enough to escape resolution. Too small for escalation, too strange for dismissal. The forest did not yield artifacts. The sky did not yield data. Institutions moved on. Witnesses did not. And investigators are left with a case that resists closure, not because it points towards something extraordinary, but because it never pointed clearly at anything at all. That may be the most unsettling possibility. Not that something unknown visited the forest, but that something happened, was observed, was documented just enough to matter, and then slipped between systems designed to explain it, leaving behind a record that cannot be completed, only revisited. And as long as those gaps remain, the incident continues to exist in an unfinished state, not solved, not debunked, simply unresolved. And that unresolved space, quiet and unremarkable, is where the case still lives. What remains at the end of this investigation is not an answer. It is a boundary, a line beyond which the record does not extend and memory cannot reliably follow. Jim Penniston is still certain that something unusual occurred in the forest, not because it fits a theory, but because it did not fit his training. What he knew then was limited to observation and duty. What he knows now is filtered through years of scrutiny, support, and skepticism. John Burroughs continues to carry the event differently, less as a sighting, more as an experience, its meaning shaped by consequence, not conclusion. What he knew then was confusion. What he knows now is that uncertainty does not fade simply because time passes. Charles Hall documented what he could, when it mattered, not to persuade, but to preserve. What he knew then was that something was unresolved. What he knows now is that documentation alone does not guarantee explanation. Institutions did what institutions often do. They assessed risk, they found none, they moved on. The United States Air Force did not pursue the matter. The Ministry of Defense closed the file. That decision answered a procedural question. It did not answer a human one. Because the absence of threat is not the presence of understanding. Skeptical explanations remain strong. They explain much of what was seen, much of what was misperceived, and much of what was later amplified. They remind us that human perception is limited, especially at night, especially under expectation. But skepticism at its most honest also acknowledges residue, those small elements that resist neat classification, not proof of something extraordinary, just evidence that the system did not fully capture what occurred. And that may be the most important lesson here. Rendlesham does not demand belief, it does not reward certainty, it asks something quieter. How many events fall between categories, noticed enough to be recorded, but not enough to be resolved? How often does uncertainty survive not because it hides something profound, but because no mechanism exists to finish the work? The forest remains unchanged, the bases continue operating, the Cold War that framed the incident has ended, but the record remains incomplete. Not because someone decided to conceal the truth, but because truth requires conditions that were never met. Continuous data, clear jurisdiction, timely investigation. These conditions did not exist then, they cannot be recreated now. This documentary is supported in part by Open Nutrition, which believes sustained focus matters, whether in health or in careful inquiry. You can learn more at opennutrition.com. As you leave this case behind, consider what it represents. But a question left open. What happens when something occurs outside expectation, outside urgency, and outside the frameworks designed to explain it? Does it disappear? Or does it linger, quietly unresolved, waiting, not for belief, but for a way to be understood?